So, whenever I'm trying to prepare for a class, there's usually a couple things that I struggle with. First is, the material, the topic, whatever I struggle with is I have all these different thoughts and ideas as far as how can I present it in a way that is most understandable, most beneficial, and am I going to be able to connect all these different thoughts that I have and at the end accomplish that goal? So that's the first thing that I feel worried about whenever I'm preparing. The other is, at the end, whenever I'm done, is it going to be like 15 minutes long? And then we don't have any other material. That's never happened, and probably won't happen tonight. But those are the two things that I'm like, oh, I don't know. And so whenever I was looking at this particular lesson, Jeremiah mentioned at the start of lesson 10 that these are all kind of building on each other. The stuff that we talked about previous lessons lead up to the one before, lead up to this one. And so whenever I was looking at it, I kind of tried to maybe take a little bit of a different approach, a little bit of a roundabout way to talk about the things that the author talked about. And we'll incorporate some of what we learned what we covered in lesson 9 and 10 as well, but kind of throughout the whole Bible class study. I don't want to just come up here and just read right out of the book. I mean, that's boring. It's just restating what's already been stated, right? If we've prepared, we've already read through it, and so, what can we do? What can I try to do that will maybe highlight or bring out different points or aspects than what the author has? I wasn't at all sad that Jeremiah didn't get all the way through the material from lesson 10, because, like I said, they build on each other, and if he would have gone through all of it, I've taken all my points. So wasn't sad that he didn't finish that, but because we'll kind of be hitting on a lot of the same topics. So with that, let's get started. Tonight's lesson was the work of the church evangelism. So, the entire book, just kind of in general, has been about what? It's been about authority. It's been about the church. It's been about denominationalism, about institutionalism. These different things that, growing up, I've heard them my whole life, basically. And on some of them, I got to thinking, do I really know and do I really understand what we're talking about when we say these things? On some of them, got a pretty good grasp on it, but some of the others, maybe it's a little vague. So what I thought we'd do is start out with some definitions. First couple should be pretty easy softballs. But, I don't know if you remember last time that I got to talk, one thing I was like, see, can you read my mind? And see if what your answers match kind of what I came up with. But first one is simply church. How would you define, how would you explain the church?
The body, group of Christians.
Body, a group of Christians. Good.
Group of Christians meeting for a common goal.
Okay. Group of Christians meeting for a common goal. Most of these I got from Vine's dictionary. A couple got out of Merriam-Webster. So, church most often is ecclesia, if not every time, from the Greek, and it's a calling out of, or a group, or a gathering. There's an example I didn't write down, but in Acts where it talks about they came together, not as like a congregation or worship, but it was just a gathering of like people in the square. It was a group that had gathered together. So in the Bible, church is used two different ways. How is it used whenever we read about the church or the ecclesia in the Bible? Somebody give me one way. I'm sorry. Okay. In a universal sense, good. Just kind of a generic gathering of people called out. What about the second? I'm sorry? Autonomous. I think I heard local. Yeah. So you have the two senses of the church as the universal kingdom, and then the church as a local gathering of saints. Very good. Okay. What about authority? How would you define authority?
The right to command or legislate, and then the permission granted by one who has that right.
Okay. So, power, the ability to grant permission, to exercise command. Okay. This one I couldn't get out of Vine's. Denomination. It's not in the Bible, so I had to go to Merriam-Webster. How would you define denomination? Not in the money terms or numerical necessarily. I mean, this is one of them where it's like, yeah, we're non-denominational. Like, we're Church of Christ is non-denominational. Well, what does that mean? Well, what is a denomination?
So, like a range within a class, so falling under the same heading or topic, yet differing from one another within that.
Yeah, so it's, according to Merriam-Webster, definition of denomination in a religious sense is a religious organization whose congregations are united in their adherence to its beliefs and practices. So, next, institution. This is another one that, argument of institutionalism. It's an established organization or a corporation, bank, university, especially of public character. So whenever we talk about it in a religious sense, it's an established organization that for us would be outside of what God has given us. These last two are ones that hopefully we should know pretty well too. Okay, evangelism.
Preaching the gospel.
Spreading, preaching the gospel. Very good. What about an evangelist?
One who?
The person, the messenger, messenger of good, or the messenger preaching the gospel. So, evangelism, how's that done? Are we given specific? Are we given generic authority on how to do this? How was it done in the first century? Go forth.
Go.
Right? So, what it looked like back then can look like what it looked today. I mean, it can look the same as today, but that generic of go doesn't limit on the how. Right. I mean, it could be going, it can be writing, it can be whatever, as long as it is spreading what God has given us, God's word. Okay. So, with kind of these thoughts and definitions kind of in our mind and in our head, I thought, well, let's kind of look at, and this is where it might be a little bit different than what you might expect. Okay, so we have Jesus as the king, right? We talked about the church and the kingdom. The church and the kingdom is made up of the building. Where we go? No, it's of the saints, right? It's a monarchy. Jesus is our king. Whenever I was thinking of, what is there somewhere where it talks about Jesus being the king of his kingdom? Really, the first one that popped in my head is whenever Pilate was talking to him and interrogating before he was crucified. Somebody want to turn over to John 18 and read verse 36 and 37, please.
Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. And 37. Pilate therefore said to him, Are you a king then? Jesus answered, You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice.
Okay, thank you. So Jesus himself calls himself king, right? So he's king of a kingdom. When was this kingdom established? Sorry? In the beginning? It may have been planned in the beginning, but when did the church get established? When did Jesus' kingdom? I'm sorry? Yeah, the day of Pentecost, exactly. Somebody turn over to Acts 2, verse 1 through 4.
When the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place, and suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then there appeared to them divided tongues as of fire, and one sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit, and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance.
Okay. Mark 9:1 says, And he said to them, Assuredly I say to you, this is Jesus talking, that assuredly I say to you, that there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God present with power. So we have Jesus saying people are going to still be alive when they see it coming in power. And then we have that recorded in Acts 2 of when it actually happens. Now, we have ecclesia here, which is the universal sense of it, right? That we enter into this kingdom through baptism. Somebody read over Acts 2:41.
So then those who had received this word were baptized, and that day there were added about 3,000 souls.
Added where? To the church, right? So, we have the day, the time that the church came with power, and we're given info on how you're entered into this kingdom. Okay, so you have the church in the universal. Let's focus it down. We have the church now in a local sense. The group of believers that believed, were baptized, entered into the universal kingdom in a local area, joined together to worship and to work, right? And so that group that comes together form the local church. Now, the way God set it up, each local church is autonomous. They have submission. They are subject to Jesus as their king, as well as us individually in the church universal sense, right? I mean, since it's individuals that make up the local church, we're all in subjection to Jesus as king. 1 Corinthians 16:9. Most of the start of Paul's letter are good examples of stating, a group of local Christians. They're saints that are in an area. In this local congregation, God has set it up to have I think we talked about having a bishop or elders that will oversee, will shepherd the flock. Somebody turn over to Titus 1:5 and read that for us. context of this is Paul writing to Titus and giving him instructions.
For this reason I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city as I commanded you.
Thank you. So God's plan, God's design is to have elders in each of the local churches, each of the local congregations. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's a pretty cool chart. What has it got to do with our lesson? Well, one thing that we kind of made our definitions of is, well, what is denomination? What is institutionalism? What is our authority? Well, how are some ways that this gets changed today? You know, God's plan is to have each church in subjection to Him, right? It's a subjection to Jesus and to be autonomous from one another. One way that I thought of that it gets changed is churches start working together, start sharing, having some sort of weird, I don't know, some weird triangle of authority to where you have one church that is kind of working with and answering to another, but both of them are working, submitting to God, trying to, I don't know. So that's not what we read about in the Bible. We don't read about churches answering to one another. In other ways, well, what if we took out this local church being directly in submission to Jesus, and instead we'll have a mother church or a headquarter church, and then we'll have satellite churches that will be reporting or in subjection to the headquarter church and mother church or whatever. Obviously, we don't read about that in the Bible either. So we have our local churches that are autonomous to each other and in subjection to Jesus. How'd they get there? How are local churches established? Any thoughts? They just pop up? Just appear?
Gospel's got to be preached in that area.
Okay. That's what I thought of. Somebody turn over to Romans 10. Read verse 14 and 15, please.
How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news.
Thank you, Colby. So exactly, Carrie, that's exactly what I thought. You have, say, local church A, local church B. They see a need somewhere of the gospel needing to be preached. So what do? You send somebody there. Send somebody to that spot to preach. What about you have another church that says, hey, I see that need as well. We can't send anybody, or we don't have anybody that is able or willing, but we still want to help in that effort. So let's send money. Now, all of this, sending of person, sending of money, this goes back to lesson 9. Is this being done concurrently or jointly? Do you remember the difference between the two?
Your chart is concurrently.
I'm sorry?
Your chart is concurrently.
Yes. So this is an example of how we see it being done in the Bible, working concurrently, kind of working at the same time, but not jointly, not answering to, another church, and maintaining fellowship and autonomy, right? Somebody turn over to Acts 8. Read verse 4 through 8. And somebody else, Acts 11, 19 and 20.
Therefore, those who had been scattered went about preaching the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and began proclaiming Christ to them. The crowds of one accord were giving attention to what was said by Philip as they heard and saw the signs which he was performing. For in the case of many who had unclean spirits, they were coming out of them, shouting with a loud voice, and many who had been paralyzed and lame were healed. So there was much rejoicing in that city.
Thank you. Philip went down and preached. A little bit later in the chapter, what does Philip do? Goes and preaches Jesus to the Ethiopian eunuch, right? So, example of Philip going out and preaching, evangelizing. Okay, Acts 11, 19 and 20.
Now those who were scattered after the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, preaching the word to no one but the Jews only. But some of them were men from Cyprus and Cyrene, who when they had come to Antioch spoke to the Hellenists, preaching the Lord Jesus.
Thank you. Just another example of spreading and preaching. Well, so we have God's design and God's plan here of how that's done. You know, whenever you have, how does someone know counterfeit money, right? I mean, this is an example we talk about in many times, that you don't study all the wrong ways that the money is fake. You study the true, the actual money. So you know it so well that whenever there's something that's different, something that's off, you can catch it, you can spot it. It's kind of the same way here, right? We study and we know God's plan so that way we can spot a deviation from that. You know, that being said, I thought of a couple of examples of how we go from working concurrently to working jointly. So in this scenario here, we have the local churches and we have the need to hear the gospel. The difference is, well, maybe instead of sending directly to that place that needs to hear it, instead we're going to send to this organization. It goes back to lesson 10, right? This earthly organization, human organization that we have, and we're going to train them here, and we're going to get them all prepped and ready to go, and then from there, we'll send them to the place. And then there'll be enough believers that a congregation can form.
From the readings that I had done about the missionary societies, they were very popular in the 1800s throughout all that century, and really all the denominations, it was like an explosion of them. So it kind of became the mainstream way to distribute the gospel, and some of the churches of Christ obviously got caught up in that, but there was a lot of that going on.
You know, it's one of those things, I mean, just like anything that is of man's origin sounds like a pretty good idea. I mean, it sounds like it would, you know, be more efficient, more effective maybe, to have them all at one place and get them all ready to go and then send them out to these different, but is that what Paul did? What did Paul do? He traveled all over the place, right? Same as what we read of in Acts 8 with Philip. He went or was sent from a local church, a local congregation. Any other thoughts on this incorrect way?
Well, to that point, Paul didn't feel like he had to check in with somebody. Oh, can I go here and go preach? his authority was Christ and he could preach Christ. Whereas people going to these, they got to make sure they have orders from other men to preach whatever message they were taught, and they can't just make their own decisions to go where they want. They're directed to go there. Our authority is preach Christ, and we can go anywhere we want with that.
That's a good point. And that will be one of the things that we talk about in just a minute. Go ahead, Kurt.
Well, I know that in some denominations, the fundamental idea is that the common man or even educated people cannot understand the Bible clearly. So they put together a school to ordain people with their doctrine. And then those men are sent out to start congregations, and they're actually over the elders. And so there's evangelism, but it's twisted the wrong direction, because if you were to allow these people to study the scriptures themselves, most likely they would not come up with this doctrine. But having grown up in one of those denominations, I can tell you, with my dad being ordained, I know that's the way it works, and that's not Church of Christ. That's another group. But that ordination is, you have been indoctrinated. You have been certified to carry the doctrine that we taught you, not the one that you read in the Bible.
So it's not going forth to preach Jesus and God's word for salvation. It's going forth to preach the doctrine that's been given to you to spread. Very good. Okay. What about this one? Pretty similar. We have our churches and we have our need to hear the gospel. Let's throw in another church that says, hey, we have this need. All right. It's a big need. It's a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of money. How about you all just send all the funds to us, and then we can take those funds, we can take that money, we can take this, whoever needs to, we can send them out, and they can evangelize in that area. And then we can have a church in that area from these believers. What's wrong with this? Is this concurrently or jointly? Jointly, right? So God in his wisdom, the way he set it up, in these last two examples, what's lost? What's lost whenever you stop working concurrently and you start working jointly? Autonomy. Yep.
I think Jeremiah did a good job of discussing about you really, in this case, give up your responsibility. I'm going to let Church D take care of this. There's a problem, or someone does something wrong, or there's...
I sure am glad there's somebody
That's going to take care
that can handle this problem. I'll just send them money and let them handle it. Very good. So we lose autonomy. We lose our responsibility that's given to us.
You lose that relationship as well.
Exactly. You lose the fellowship, right? This is kind of the sponsor church situation, right? And this is the topic, or this is the point that the author talked about on page 64 in point C. That this is argued that whenever Paul was talking about no church communicated with me except for the Philippians, the Christians there at Philippi, but money is all being sent to the church at Philippi, and then the church at Philippi sent it on. Well, the Greek word there is koinonio. I don't know, but it's translated here as shared, but most of the time whenever you see it, especially in the American Standard, it's translated as fellowship. So you can read that as no church had fellowship with me, but only you. Now, not only you solely, but only you individually. Of these giving and receiving, it was only between me and you of those funds, and only between me and them of those funds from the other churches that also sent me. Any other thoughts on this chart?
I think that it's important to, the reason why we study about what is an expedient is for this reason, because you mentioned, maybe this is Church D has a big over, we got big things to do, but it's going to require more money than we have, so send it to us and we'll do this work. Well, then it's no longer an expedient. You're creating a problem for yourself. You're not expediting the Lord's work in that area. And so it may be a noble thought to wish that or hope that one day a congregation that we're a part of can grow to the size to be able to send more preachers out to more areas or help more needy saints in more areas. But the Lord only wants you to do what you can do. And as far as benevolence is concerned, that's mentioned in 2 Corinthians 8. But the general principle would also apply to any work of the church carried out by the local church. God does not require more of us than what we're capable. And when we, bite off more than we can chew, so to speak, we're creating a problem for ourselves, which unravels into other consequences as well.
You brought up, maybe it's a couple of weeks ago, the example of, let's say we want to have a TV program to preach the word, or a radio spot or something. That's okay. That's good. I mean, that's a good avenue. That's an authorized. It's perfectly fine to do that if you can support it. If you can do it. Now, you can't say, I want to do this, but don't quite have enough money. Hey, church over here, can you give us some money so that way we can have enough to be able to do it? This is exactly what you're talking about. It's like it's a good thing. It's a noble idea. It's a noble thought. If you can handle it, if you can do it.
Well, in the mind of human being, in the mind of us all, there might be really great ideas and really good thoughts and good practices that we could all do and in our minds do some good. But anytime we move past the point of God's arrangement, God's law, then it becomes illegitimate. It is no longer legitimate. And especially when we use legitimate in terms of conforming to law. The church is Christ's legitimacy.
Yep.
We cannot change it, add to it, take away from it, even though in our thought, it's a good thing that we're doing. If it doesn't follow God's law, the law that is set up and that's legitimate, we have overstepped where there is no good then.
It reminds me, or makes me think of what's going to happen at the end of time, at judgment. Well, Jesus is going to turn over the kingdom to God, right? With the church without spot or blemish. Adding anything to it is going to illegitimize it or make it have a spot or a blemish. Kurt, and then Scott.
There's a segment of this that thankfully we really don't have to deal with any longer. I mean, for those of us with little white hairs and gray hair, remember a time when in order to produce a television show or a radio program, it was costly. It had to be done by professionals. It had to be done through a local TV or radio organization. It was incredibly expensive, even if you got on public television and only got a couple of half-an-hour segments a week. Now, 2 high school kids with a cell phone can, produce TV and radio, if you want to call it radio, and do evangelism in that way with virtually no cost at all.
Yep.
So part of that function here goes away. But the part that doesn't go away is reminding everybody that, say it takes money to send someone to a foreign country and provide for them in that point. And say a plane ticket's $4,000 and this congregation just can't afford to do that. So the point is still valid, but thankfully the problems that we saw 20, 30, 40 years ago no longer exist.
It just changes, right? The principle is the same.
Right.
It's just the method on how it's done, on how it changes. Scott?
Well, we're taught that funds, benevolence is needed and very important for the work of a local church. And so are the work, and for people to do the work. We're supposed to give and we're supposed to work. Giving a bunch doesn't trump that you don't have
Working
to work.
little. Yeah.
Or working a bunch doesn't mean you don't have to give as much, because you do a lot of the work around here. I don't need to give as much anymore. And then that's what this does, is bypass that, like what Aaron was saying, is you just throw money at it, and you don't have to throw the work at it. And if anybody's been working with schools or people lately, people just want to throw money at your charities or whatever. They don't want to work. Here, I'll hand you this. Here's a check. Keep me out of it. And that's what you get a lot of this time.
Again, glad there's somebody that can take care of this problem. I just give them some money and it'll get fixed. So I think that idea that we just talked about there on the last chart is what the writer was talking about here, which is the chart on page 65. I didn't really, it kind of was a little bit confusing to me with the dotted lines and the solid lines, so I don't know. I changed it to me this made more sense. Maybe just me, or maybe I'm off, but to me it makes more sense of, the churches that had no fellowship with Paul under that sponsoring church idea was the ones that would send it to Philippi first and then Philippi sending it down to Corinth. As opposed to the red arrows, whenever they are sending it directly to Paul, they maintain that fellowship and they maintain that autonomy, right? They don't lose that control. And that's the other thing with that chart that we just had up there. If you were just sending your money over to this other church, you lose control on how it's used. Like, you cannot control how those funds are spent. What if you don't agree with the way that it's spent? Well, you just participated in something obviously something that's not authorized in the Bible, but you lose your autonomy, you lose your control. Any thoughts on this chart? We're going to wrap up. We have just a couple minutes left. So these were just kind of some of the summary points that I came up with. God in his wisdom planned for the church to be preaching the gospel for salvation from before time. Somebody turn over and read Ephesians 3, 8 through 11, please. Quickly.
Believe no less than the least of all the saints, this grace was given that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to make all see what is the fellowship of the mystery which from the beginning of the ages has been hidden in God, who created all things through Jesus Christ, to the intent that now the manifold wisdom of God might be made known by the church to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places, according to the eternal purpose which he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord.
That hits all the points, right? From before time, the church preaching Jesus and his authority. Okay? It's the work of the church to grow the kingdom through evangelism. This is the Romans verse that we read earlier. I think Colby read it. But how are they going to hear? How are they going to believe if they don't hear? How are they going to hear if they don't send? Who's going to send? So, growing the kingdom through evangelism. Preaching and teaching God's word only. Reaching out, evangelism through that way. This responsibility is not limited to the preachers or the elders of a local congregation, it is everybody's responsibility, right? Somebody turn over and read 2 Timothy 4:2, and somebody else Acts 5:42, please.
Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, events, rebuke, exhort, with all long suffering and teaching.
Who's to be ready? Just Timothy? Ball's right into Timothy. So just Timothy needs to be ready, right? Obviously not. It's for all of us. Okay? Acts 5:42. Yes.
And daily in the temple and in every house they did not cease teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ.
So everybody. Just cut off. I had 2 more points. Okay, so congregation must maintain the authority and control whenever they are practicing evangelism, sending out people or funds. And any changes to God's plan, God's design, is a rejection of God's will. Thank you very much for your attention and participation.